thank you all for taking the time out of this busy schedule to spend an hour with us. This is Ask the Experts, Titans of Technology. I'm Rick Scherer. I think this was I can't remember, the 9th or 10th year.
I've seen some tweets saying it's the 10th.
Yeah.
But you've been moderating the whole time, so you'd be the authority.
It's been so long I can't remember how long it's been. But I think this is the 10th year that I've had the honor of hosting and moderating this event. And we usually have some fun. There's usually
been
something.
Good ones and bad ones. The correlation is what they do. Not who's on
obviously,
stage.
Obviously, the panelists on stage don't matter at all, in all honesty.
Obviously,
and
the crowd.
And the audible that we had to pull today is proof, positive that the panelists don't matter at all. And I'll get more to that story here in a second, because I'll make fun of someone that's not here because they're not here.
Fantastic.
But so Titans of Tech, Ask the Experts. By a show of hands, who's the first time attending this session?
Oh,
wow.
Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, noobs.
Good.
All right.
The question is, how many came back after the last?
Well, it's a showing that how bad this session is.
Yeah, high turnover. High churn. Not good.
The majority is new visitors. So for the majority of the audience that have never attended this session before, the rules are pretty straightforward. The audience drives the session ultimately. This is what we would consider an expert panel Q&A, where our esteemed panelists answer your questions. Right? We have expertise across many different vectors of technology from many different organizations here, and we want to hear about what's on your mind, hear about the challenges that you're dealing with, hear about questions you may have about the industry, like where are things going. Is this containerization thing the next VM, and should I be worried about losing all my ESX hosts, right? Those are the types of questions that we'd love to hear about. So we have a couple of microphones in the room here on the stage left and stage right side, and ultimately it's up to you guys to start forming lines behind those microphones. And I have a few questions that I'll obviously start the panel off with, but by the time I get one or two questions done, I'd love to have lines of people behind those microphones. And I say every year, if there's no one behind the microphone, ultimately we'll probably just stare at each other and
awkward,
just awkward silence and chat amongst friends here. But again, and last warning, this session is about you guys, and you're really driving the success of this session. So we again have our microphones on both sides. So I'd invite anyone that wants to be that first person. I know the first is always the hardest, but it usually breaks the seal, and we do awesome after that. So feel free to make way up to that microphone.
All right.
Awesome. We have our first person. So I'll get to you in just a second.
After all of that.
So I appreciate you putting yourself out there and a little bit of awkwardness, and then I immediately just squash you down. But unfortunately, that's how it is, because I have the clicker right now. So the first couple things I want to do is obviously show this wonderful disclaimer that we may talk about future things. No one really cares. And then after this, we have our introduction of our panelists here, which I'll do quickly because, again, I want to make sure I have enough time to answer all these questions here. So first and foremost, as your moderator, I'm Rick Scherer. I'm a principal architect with Dell EMC, and I support a couple of our largest global accounts. My long history in VMware, VCDX 21, been leveraging VMware technologies since 1999, and just passionate IT geek. In a different order than the panelists that are being seated here, I have Colbert, who runs the cloud business platforms within VMware. So if you've heard anything around cloud native applications and our technologies around like vSphere integrated containers, Photon OS, and things like that.
Also, the VMware Cloud in AWS. That's part of that group as well.
So. Oh, hold on. Has anyone ever used vMotion? He's the guy that wrote most of that, so there you go.
Well, a long time ago.
I can like one of the most important things in the world.
You can't milk that forever, dude.
Come on, no, you can't. It's vMotion.
It's true. It's true.
It's vMotion.
I'm making the most out of it.
The kid looks like he's 12, so what is a long time?
I will say my first vMotion, I'll never forget it.
Exactly.
Now that's a little awkward.
Next, we have Mr. Duncan Epping, esteemed technologist, top blogger, VMware advocate for, ever, and just a great friend, and love to have him back on the panel this year.
He used to be a great author. Now he just reviews other people's books for the most part. But the early ones were awesome.
I will surprise you in a couple of months, probably.
Oh, exciting.
Just wait.
Next to me, I have Mr. Chad Sakac, who runs the, what are we calling it now today?
It's a long-winded acronym. I asked if I could change it. I can't. Converged Platform and Solutions Division, CPSD. It sounds kind of like a venereal disease in acronym form. But
I don't think we're going to be selling much product if you sell like that.
The long and the short of it is the team that build converged platforms, so VxBlock, VxRail, VxRack, SDC Flex, but also turnkey systems, cloud stacks, Azure stack as well, not just inside the VMware ecosystem. So anytime a customer doesn't want the pieces, but instead wants the whole meal.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Chad becoming a president and leading a BU probably lost the majority of your technical mojo.
Oh, come on.
So, it's all about...
Oh my God, I'll take this out of my back. You know how to...
Yeah. Doing a lot of TPS reports now, things like that. And, profit and loss analysis. And
I still think
big dinners with Michael Dell.
Come on. I'm more technical than you ever will be. Still.
All right. Our challenge accepted. And then we have our special audible. And I mentioned earlier I'm going to make fun of someone that's not here. So a good friend of mine by the name of Josh Gwyther, and if you Twitter or Instagram and you look up Josh Gwyther, feel free to follow him and make fun of him and blast him for not being here. Josh is with Google and was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, unforeseen circumstances happened and he was unable to be here. I don't know the real story. I think it's a crock full of BS. I think there was another issue that happened in Vegas maybe a few years back where his wife said, "You're not going back there." So I'll find out the real story after and I'll make sure I tweet that out.
Josh is better anyway.
You mean Jonathan?
Yeah, Jonathan. Yeah. It's better anyway.
So I had an intention of, because we've done this a few times in the past, I was just going to maybe grab someone from the audience. And we always have fun doing that. Up front, at the very beginning, I ran into Jonathan, who I've had the luxury of knowing for quite some time, working together in different capacities. Jonathan actually is part of the Office of the CTO with Google, so even a way better name and title than Josh.
It's like his acronym. It sounds kind of cooler than it really is.
Yeah. You know what? Technical Director of the CTO sounds pretty cool compared to Josh Gwyther, who knows what he does at Google, because he's not here.
Full disclosure, I worked for Chad, worked with you, right, and helped do VCD, so we've got a long history together.
Excellent. What do you do at Google?
So my goal at Google from the Office of CTO is helping Google figure out what their hybrid cloud strategy is going to look like, what it's going to entail over time.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being the audible for today. I appreciate it. All right, so 50 minutes of pure open Q&A, and we have a good lineup now. We have our first three, and we'll hopefully get more behind that. So gentlemen, I appreciate you waiting and being number one. We'll turn it over to you.
All right, I'll start off with the softball question, and I've asked this every time I've come to VMworld. And the first time I asked the question, it basically is, what are you guys running in a home lab? And at that time, was 5 or 6 years ago, Chad had a ridiculous setup with a VNX and multiple hosts and everything else. Now with the cloud being relatively inexpensive, how many people still have a home lab? Are you guys moving off the cloud when you do your testing?
Yeah. You want to go first? Well, yeah, I use the cloud at this point.
I still actually, so the ridiculous home lab is retired, much to my personal chagrin, but to my family's happiness. I still actually maintain a small little home lab that I build the host myself every year, just because it gives me a little bit of personal joy to take out the screwdriver and play and have a little bit of fun and poke around and remind myself that what Rick teases me about, which is my greatest nightmare, is that I become, executive, just a shill, a suit in a suit, isn't true. But almost all of my personal learning now, I actually spend way more time trying to learn more about the application ecosystem, and I do almost the entirety of that inside Pivotal Web Services, inside AWS. That's my new frontier.
Yeah, so for me, within VMware, we actually have a developers cloud, which is called Nimbus, which is an awesome way of testing new builds, new products, you name it. I can spin out any environment, whether that's 3 hosts or 64 hosts, literally within 20 minutes, which is great for me because I primarily work on vSAN. So I don't need to bother setting up a vCenter server. I don't need to look at ESXi, all of the different configuration steps, the networking. I just roll it out and start testing it. Having said that, over the past couple of months, I've been considering actually buying a home lab for the first time in probably 5 years. We're looking at the Xeon D series, which is, I think, a great solution for home labs because they have 8 cores, relatively cheap. They don't make a lot of noise. Those solutions seem to work pretty well with vSAN. There's a couple of articles out there, and that's the setup I'm looking at, potentially buying 2 nodes for vSAN and then running a witness up on workstation or something like that, just to get some more playtime with ESX itself and other stuff. Because the great thing about using a cloud is that you don't need to set it up. The bad part is that you don't set it up yourself. So I haven't done a lot of work in vCenter, for instance, in ages.
And then from my perspective, I would say it all depends on what you're trying to learn, right? So when I was working for VCE, which was one of the joint ventures with VMware, or I was working for Intel, having a home lab, right, being able to set it up, take the screwdriver, do those sort of things, because that what I was trying to learn was very, very important to me. Now they work for Google, obviously. Now I'm trying to learn cloud APIs, machine learning, that sort of thing, which is really kind of harder to set up at scale in your own lab, right? So I think it just depends on what you're trying to learn, right? And then you find the right resources to do that.
Yeah, I'll say that, so I use some AWS for a bunch of projects, and then we also have another internal cloud at VMware called OneCloud, which we can actually run nested. So I get a bunch of VM, or I get access to some ESX hosts, and I can then provision ESX on top of that, so I get the installation experience and actually operating an ESX cluster, vSphere cluster myself.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
What technology would you say you're the most excited about from the VMware suite right now?
That one for me is easy. So the things that excite me are about things that are going to change the industry. So like I love things that are interesting and nerdy and geeky. Like that's fun and interesting in one dimension. But then things that have impact in market and in customers is far more interesting to me, and it can offset that a little bit, right? So vSAN's a huge commercial success, and it's going to be wildly disruptive to the external storage industry, and it already is, right? NSX is going to cause industry landscape changes that are enormous because they're affecting, $70 billion TAMs, right? They're going after markets that are ginormous. The 2 things that are the most interesting to me about this week, app defense is one, right? Because that problem, I don't think people realize how pervasive that is in the market and in the customers. So, we can have the coolest tech on the planet, and if a customer gets completely wiped out by malware, it's a massive problem, and it's something that Tom Korn and the team there at VMware have been dreaming about for a while, and it's really cool because in its first release, it's solving a big enough problem to move the needle, in my opinion. That's the first thing. The second one I can't talk about now because it's not going to get announced until tomorrow.
Yeah, that's true. Ask us tomorrow. It's a different answer. For me, it's it's VMware Cloud and AWS. I'm super excited about it. I think it's just something that, just from an announcement perspective about these two companies partnering, I think it surprised a lot of people. But at the same time, once we talk to customers, it makes total sense. Yep. From the technology side, the thing I'm really excited about is that there has been a tremendous amount of innovation happening on both sides. The AWS engineers working closely with our engineers at VMware to do things that have never been done before. Amazon's never let in anyone else into their data centers, and we're running on bare metal inside of Amazon's data center, right? Never done that before. So all sorts of security challenges and other things, automation challenges. But what also excites me about that as an engineer looking at our engineering organization is that we can now, we are operating vSphere as a service, right? This VMware engineers are actually operating this thing as a service. So we patch ESX, upgrade vCenter, do all that stuff for you, right? And because of that, it fundamentally changes the delivery model. We're no longer shipping shrink-wrapped software to customers, right? We now have a CI/CD pipeline direct to all those hosts running in AWS, meaning we can potentially update it very frequently if we need to, right? And so this movement toward a SaaS-first model, toward a DevOps sort of approach is a fundamental shift and will allow us to drive up quality, drive up speed, and drive up correctness of features. We can get immediate feedback and do tons of little tweaks to features as we need to. So that's really exciting in terms of the type of innovations that we can bring to customers.
And by the way, that'll have a feedback loop into things that aren't even in that offer yet. So I'm really excited about that process impacting VRA, lifecycle management, and simplicity, the whole vRealize suite. That feedback loop, I can already feel it emanating into those product teams.
Yeah, the thing is that what you see, if you look at the industry at large, SaaS software that's cloud first, is just fundamentally better than on-premises software, primarily because of the fact that you get immediate feedback on it, right? And you can do this kind of what they call A/B testing, which is push out a change to one set of users and measure that impact of that change compared to a control group with the older version. You can see very clearly, do these changes you want to make actually have the impact that is desired? And so the opportunity to apply that to vSphere is, I think, game-changing and fundamental.
Yeah, for me, it's fairly simple. vSAN, Chad already mentioned it. It's what I work on a daily basis. I don't know if anyone has already seen some of the announcements around vSAN or said in the session by Christos. But there's some cool stuff coming up for vSAN. There's one session in particular that I think tomorrow or the day after, which is about vSAN data protection, which is a new thing that we have a tech preview for. I can't say too much about it because I think there's an announcement on that as well tomorrow. But that's something that I'm really excited about, not just because of vSAN data protection by itself, but if you combine that with something like VMware Cloud on AWS, and then look at the number of possibilities you have in terms of use cases and how it will help you do disaster recovery in a fairly optimized fashion. I think that's very exciting. The other thing is the IoT space. It's not something that I'm involved in, but just the edge computing is something that I'm starting to follow more closely. Just because I don't think anyone has a clue what's going to happen in that space, and it's going to blow up in the upcoming 5 years for sure. So that's something that I'm really interested in, but there's not much to talk about at this point.
The thing that's interesting is there's more there than I think we've told the market. So Pulse as a platform is starting to cook that work effort. Mm-hmm. There's this whole EdgeX Foundry initiative to try to make, the thing that sucks is that all of the edge devices all have different data models, protocols.
Highly proprietary
They're
stuff.
completely proprietary. So what the collective, we all on stage and industry at large are trying to do is say, hey, look, these things don't ever really take off until you have some common standards. So EdgeX Foundry is some real work there. And the amount of activity that's already going on IoT edge devices is surprising.
Yeah.
That's a good observation.
Well, yeah, and I think if you look at what the analysts are saying, just talking about edge for a minute, they're saying, I don't know what the time frame is, maybe 10 to 15 years or so, but they're estimating the number of workloads running in the edge will actually surpass that running in public cloud. But you think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing, right? Just the amount of workloads out there. So the opportunity to bring a lot of these benefits that we've seen in the data center to how you'd build software out to those edge, which again, it's highly proprietary, much slower moving, and so forth, is huge, right? So that's going to be a huge one coming down the road.
And it's also you will see the workload shifting from on-premises or in the cloud down to the edge, because the data will need to be processed somewhere else to respond extremely fast to what you've just analyzed. So that's going to introduce a major change in the industry.
Slight correction there. I think it's not a movement of the workload. I think it's a breaking apart of the workload.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So I think you're going to have the workloads that run in some sort of consolidated public cloud concept, right? And then you're going to have those functions pushed towards the edge that make the most sense, and probably several layers of it.
By the way, that's why the first thing you should do whenever you talk to an analyst, and the analyst says, everyone is going to do fill in the blank, just punch them right in the face. Just punch them right in the face, get it over with. There's a tendency in PR and AR, and if there's people here that are in analysts and press, I'm sorry, I don't mean you personally, but to try to make all of these changes, they try to distill it down into like something that is digestible in like a tiny soundbite, and they're much more complex. Like what's actually happening is so many moving pieces. It's a complex system.
So Jonathan, I know not being with VMware, and kind of the question was VMware focused, just technology in general, what's exciting to you right now?
So I think that one of the things that's most exciting to me right now in coming to the conference here is seeing, no matter whose public cloud you use, right, but people really embracing that as a true extension of how they deliver their IT, right? I think it's really starting to come into its own over the past, year or so. And I think it's just going to explode from here, where people start to look at other people's data centers as equivalent to their own, right, from their operations perspective. And I think that is incredibly valuable to the industry in general. I think it's going to drive a new wave of innovation and applications that are going to help all of us, right? IoT is a prime example of that. What we can actually do with that data once we can actually start to see it, right? Those are the things that excite me the most.
One of the things that I'm going to get into the more general technology areas. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in, just as an engineer and trying to learn, the technologist learning this stuff, would be AI and machine learning,
we like
deep learning. Yeah, you guys are just a little bit into that.
We like that.
But I highly recommend, if you haven't, go take a course, like Coursera or what have you. I've taken Andrew Ng's first course, the original one on Coursera. It's a great kind of primer to all this stuff, because it's like, if you've done any programming, what you'll realize is that training an AI ML model is fundamentally different. The whole way you go about it is very different. You start looking at these neural nets and these individual kind of nodes, and they start to encode information in a really strange way that's very organic and kind of evolutionary, right? Or like an emergent property. So just as an engineer, it's really fun to start thinking about that, because it's just very, very different. And I don't know what the future holds, but I do think we're going to see a lot more things moving to those sorts of programming models over time. And so again, just as a technologist, something, investing in yourself, this is a huge area, right? Again, another fundamental disruptor.
So we had a meeting with Google in San Fran probably about 6-7 months ago. That was a precursor to some of this stuff for tomorrow. And what was fascinating was I got a peek into TensorFlow APIs and structures, and some of the infrastructure that is used underneath it, which is surprisingly proprietary, right? FPGAs and ASICs that are very purpose designed for this recursive machine learning AI like machine model. And so what's cool, and it comes back to this, we're nerds, we're geeks, we're passionate technologists. I went and actually basically Google on GCP has a whole bunch of stuff where you can start to use the AI and machine learning tools, algorithms, and sets of services at no cost. So one of the things that's so cool about cloud is that the cost to learn, forget about cost to run, right? The cost to learn has dropped so steeply, and not only in moolah, but in time, right? It was really neat for me because, again, I'm not an expert, but I got a chance to play and learn something new for a little bit. It's cool.
The pace of the accelerated pace of all these new technologies is such that you'll never go without being able to go learn something quickly and cheaply. these days, which is fantastic. It's a great place to be.
And Duncan, what excites you outside of vSAN?
Nothing.
That's what I said. Yeah. To be honest, it's more or less true. But that's what I just said. The IoT. That's what I said. The IoT space. That's what kicked off the discussion. So.
Oh, good. How about you, dude?
Rick lost his pointer there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He was sleeping.
Control.
Chad has been talking for half an hour, so I can imagine.
I completely almost fell asleep.
What about you?
To be completely honest, a couple things. One, my boys. That's like number one. I have a 3-year-old twin boy. They'll be 3-year-old in October. The twin boys take up 98% of my time. So that's like my life right now. Home lab is completely gone to nothing, and they're my life outside of this.
It wasn't technical anymore.
No. Okay. I still geek out. It's a combination of things. So one, actually, I'm very fortunate to work with one of my customers, a large financial customer, and they're working on deploying Workspace ONE right now in a POC effort. And it's been a combination of things. So one, everything from needing infrastructure to rapidly spin up this POC. So deploying Rail as part of that. That was super exciting because, just like, public cloud allows us to start innovating and start developing instantly. We had that same experience in an on-premises, data center, right? We plugged in some equipment, turned it on, and were able to start deploying the software almost instantly. So, hyperconverged, and I've made this comment before in prior years, hyperconverged is as exciting to me. What the hell is going on somewhere else? Yeah. Hyperconverged is exciting to me as virtualization was, back in the early 2000s, right? And then the appliance concept of that, of being able to spin up very quickly, is exciting to me as well. And then the things that we're doing with Workspace ONE, being able to just completely streamline their operations, right? Being able to support all of their devices with one tool set, right? And offer access to any application. I don't want to sound too much like a sales pitch, but the reality is it's, completely going to revolutionize their, end user computing environment.
Yep.
So those are a couple of the real cool things that I'm very interested in. The last one would probably be around just cloud native applications, and more so properly using and designing cloud native applications. Because I think that's a huge disconnect. And actually one of the questions I had for the panel was, I think we've kind of gone past this point now of the whole OpenStack thing, right? Unfortunately, it's kind of, and the enterprise has tapered off. I think we've realized its true value, which is more so it seems to be in the telco space. Yep. But for the enterprise use, this whole concept of, I'm going to displace VMware and save license costs by going to KVM and OpenStack, that's kind of fizzled out. The next thing now is containers, right? Oh, I'm going to displace, VMware and all that license cost by moving all my apps into a container and running them on bare metal or other form of container host. And I just sit back and this, a couple years back, I was like, the OpenStack thing was like, no, like you're doing this wrong. You're doing this wrong. Let me explain. And I feel like I'm having the same conversations around containers where it's like, no. Like you don't do that with your traditional applications. You do 12-factor methodologies and build new applications, and that's how you should leverage containers. So long-winded talk there. The question really is, does containerization stand the risk of being the next OpenStack?
No. No.
It's
not in the same way.
You're selling both technologies short by saying, does A replace B, right? Containerization and microservices are a new way of building and deploying applications. It really doesn't matter the underlying, right? You could go bare metal, you can go virtual machines. I would say predominantly it's today, it's mostly inside virtual machines, right?
Interestingly, even inside a lot of the Borg Kubernetes examples still run on top of a very lightweight kernel mode hypervisor.
I can neither confirm nor deny the Borg side of things, but for the Kubernetes side, yes. Predominantly people are using them inside of some sort of virtualization mechanism.
Well, GKE, I mean, it uses VMs, separate tenants.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The thing that I think is, it's really weird, isn't that how people, when presented with a new idea, always try to slot it into a direct comparison of, well, I want to create an analog or an analogy between two things and then decide which one of these two things is better or worse.
Well, when you get as old as we are, you got to push something out of a slot to fear your
it's a queuing mechanism, right? So the thing that I found is fascinating is that in many cases, it's driven by at the customers that I interact with, it's driven by a motivation where the infrastructure team is trying to be relevant to the dev team, which is actually a good motivation. Like that is a good driving, purpose, right? I want to become more relevant to the dev team. That's smart because the applications are what matter at the end of the day. And then the funny thing is, you find people who are just zealots on the topic. And they're like, well, we could save cost at blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, you know that ESXi is free, first things first. Just to get it if you wanted to just go down that path and you see zero value in everything else, you're still going to basically get value out of virtualization, kernel mode virtualization for the physical abstraction from the underlying hardware layer. It's true that if you had 100% cloud native apps where they all followed the 12-factor core principles, they were all built around that design point, that yes, there's less benefit to things like vMotion because basically, and DRS, because there's a cluster manager that's handling resource management at some layer. Notice the words I used. I didn't say no, I said less, right? Where some of those functions move. Yes, there's less value in VMHA because you generally have a cluster manager that is doing a restart and health management function a little bit higher up in the stack. But then if I turn around and I go, and look, we'll do it here in the room. How many of you, all of your applications, 100% of them are built around cloud native principles? Show of hands. Exactly, right? Zero. Now, by the way, how many of you would say 5% of your application estate are well-written, properly designed cloud native apps? Anyone? So we got one. So we could keep asking, that eventually we'd find the percentage. But even in the most advanced big customers that are enterprises that I see, it's sub 5%. Now they're smart and they know that yes, any dollar spent, the smartest place to spend that dollar these days is to think at the application layer and try to tackle the problem there, because there's a whole trickle-down effect all the way through the stack. But the world is not that binary.
Well, yeah, it's not. And I think part of it is you can get really down in the weeds of the technology, and it's important to take a step back and what's the point of all this stuff? What are we doing here, right? And Pat talked a lot about this in the keynote today, the importance of IT to business, that in fact most businesses, it is IT that's driving this, right? The engagement with customers and so forth. And so what a lot of the web giants like Twitter and Facebook, Google, et cetera, have found is that they had to employ certain types of processes and organizational structures and changes in application architecture in order to get the type of scale and type of speed that they were really looking for. And so it's really these sorts of patterns that we're starting to find as we look into the whole cloud native space. The use of container technologies, the sort of 12-factor distributed sorts of architectures, microservice type of architectures, the DevOps sort of principles, continuous integration and deployment. Again, a lot of these things that we as an industry discovered over the past 15, 20 years, right? And so that at a high level is really where we're going. And I think fundamentally it's the more important thing here is actually the process and the structure of your organization rather than any specific technology. Once you have that high level structure, once you know where you're going, then it's a question of, okay, how do I bring the right technologies to bear in this process? And certainly containers help tremendously for a lot of application management and deployment and so forth. They're not that much different from VM technology in many ways.
It's an abstraction.
It is. They're both containers that can contain things, and it doesn't really matter what's inside of them. Now, containers have done a great job in terms of certain types of usability. They're much easier for developers to use than VMs ever were, and shame on us for that. We should have done better there. But it's great. We can embrace these technologies, and that's what we're doing. But so containers are one part of this much bigger puzzle, which is how do you move faster? And to your point, it's like you have a lot of these applications today which have a more traditional architecture, and it may not make sense at all to re-architect them, since re-architecture is expensive, and you're probably going to break stuff, and it's going to take a while to get there. For some apps, it's going to be worth it. For a lot, it's not. And so what you're going to have is this environment that has some VMs, some containerized applications that haven't really been re-architected, some that have, and then some things like Lambdas or function as a service, serverless type models, which are even further down the sort of re-architecture path. And it's how all those come together. But again, you're looking at it from what are you trying to do as a business? How are you moving faster? What's really important? And I think that's where a lot of these things come in. So I don't see containers displacing VMs. I do see some people, again, being overzealous about it, maybe using it to try and be overly disruptive or whatever, or to get things done that might otherwise be challenging from a process standpoint. Sometimes people bring in new technology to avoid process. But fundamentally, I look at these as kind of a better together approach.
And so being in the field mostly, I unfortunately hear too much of the negative of companies trying to displace virtual machine technology with container technology for the wrong reasons. And it just, it scares me because I don't want it to become the next OpenStack because it's trying to be implemented incorrectly.
I have to say, what I found is the best way to do it is actually to encourage them to find a small thing and run. Because if you try to tell someone, like, don't do something, if you're a parent, you understand this, right? It's very difficult to stop someone because as soon as you say don't do that, their first instinct is to go, well, you were wrong, and I'm going to do it anyway, right? Conversely, if you can go and you can say, okay, take the time to learn and go, and then you kind of tell someone else in the organization, just do something that's a little bit fenced off from from just blowing up the whole business, it actually ends up a lot more successful. People then they become much more pragmatic about.
Well, I think they don't realize that fundamentally, again, with containers, like. You have the same set of challenges you have to solve with any workload, whether it's container-based or VM-based. To run into production, you got to have some basic monitoring system, logging system. You need some security and compliance strategy. You need a backup strategy, DR strategy. I mean, these are all just basic things you need to run something in production. And if you actually, to your point, go and try it and try to figure all those things out, you quickly realize that those things can be very challenging, and that it takes a lot longer than you think it does. It's not nearly as easy as you might think it is.
Awesome. I think we've got the Michael Bay panel next door.
Transformers 25.
Question.
I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one's about vSAN. The second one is about running VDI in that vSAN. First, I'm running all-flash 18-node vSANs, and the deduplication and compression ratios are only between 1.8 and 2.3. We're not running snapshots, and we're not running backups. So my question is, if there's anything practical that I can do to increase those ratios and therefore to get more out of my storage.
You want me to answer the question?
Yeah.
Sure. So from a vSAN perspective, the way vSAN works is it's an object-based storage solution, which means that every single device and every single disk group is a separate entity. Now, from a vSAN perspective, although you enable deduplication and compression on a clustering level, right, which may feel to a lot of people that it's doing global deduplication. From a vSAN perspective, deduplication actually happens on the disk group level, which also means that from a disk group perspective, if you have a low number of devices within that disk group, but you have multiple disk groups, that the potential results could be disappointing. The other thing, as I said, it's an object-based storage solution, which also means that it's not a distributed file system. So from a vSAN perspective, what happens when you deploy a virtual machine is that a virtual machine is an object, and the object is split in one or multiple components, depending on how you set up the policy, right? So now these components get stored in multiple disk groups. And depending on the duplicate blocks within that disk group, those are the results you will be seeing. So the first tip would always be create larger disk groups, if that's what you're going after, right? If you want to have a higher deduplication ratio, create a disk group which is relatively large. Second of all, is of course the workload. So depending on what type of workload it is, if there's a lot of duplicate information in there, results may differ. But 2-3x is what I see typically for a lot of customers, depending on the type of workloads. Again, in some cases for VDI, you also see it going up to 7 or 8x.
The thing that I would suggest also, just in addition to that, but this is a pro and a con. Like it has a downside to it, is that are you keeping all of the core user data inside the VM images?
No, they're outsourced Profile Unity on NetApp.
So that's good, because then you have to look at the total aggregate dedupe rate, because you're presumably using dedupe on the FAS devices,
so
right?
the NetApp would be handling the snapshots.
Yep.
And from what I've seen, you get ratios up to 30. That's only when there's a high amount of snapshots or backups being done.
Yeah. So if the user data being inside the VM would lower the aggregate dedupe rate, but since you've already tackled that, that was going to be my one additional
So we're the customer at ease by talking about the average between the NetApp that we're using, and so that's good. Thank you. Was there more for that, or?
What was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question is a little bit different. So with VDI, currently we're using full clone persistent disk. And so we're going to try to switch to instant clones or to linked clones. But there's a large challenge in trying to get a feel for exactly how much storage we'd be freeing up by moving to a distributed and layered storage infrastructure. So for example, before we were using Unidesk, and those VMs were using an extremely small amount of storage compared to the full clones. And so if I could fit only about 700 persistent full clones onto a cluster with persistent disks, then I was just wondering roughly how many VMs I could fit on if I switch it either to linked or instant clones. And an embedded question, if I could tag that along too, is the decision between linked clones and instant clones is something that eludes me, because I found many other people have been using that phrase interchangeably, and it turns out that they're actually quite different. And so there's strategy involved with that, and if we could find that moving from persistent to either instant or linked would give us the highest amount of server density, which is our business goal, we just want to be able to fit as many VMs as possible, which is why clearly we're moving away from the full clones.
Yeah. How much do you know?
Well, I'm not, first of all, I'm not a Horizon or View expert. Having said that, I mean, if you look at your question, there's 2 or 3 parts of it, right? If you look at VDI and you're talking about density, typically storage is not the issue.
It's not storage capacity.
No, because you can cram a lot of even SSDs into a single unit. I have a customer doing 28 nodes with 2 petabyte worth of all-flash storage. So in most cases, storage capacity is not the issue. So what is the issue? Well, that's typically the amount of cores that you have to your disposal, and the amount of memory that fits in a single machine. On top of that, the risk that the number of virtual machines that you're running on top of a single physical host is also increasing if something happens to that particular physical host. So it's for me, a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I can guarantee you that the results from a link clone or an instant clone, of course, will vastly exceed the full clones that you're doing right now. From a VMware perspective, that is also what we've been pushing forward. Instant clones is definitely the way forward. Majority of my customers doing VDI, Horizon, are either doing instant clones or are moving towards instant clones, simply because from a TCO perspective, ROI standpoint, it's the best option.
And that's instead of link clones.
That's instead of link clones, yeah. I mean, link clones is...
Well, they're different technologies, right?
So it's also ancient. I mean, it's not something that I would expect being used
instant clones
3 years from now.
Instant clone uses link clones,
yeah,
right,
but not
for the disk.
Of course, but from a vSAN perspective, I was just talking about vSAN data protection, something new that we're working on that has an underlying new snapshotting mechanism, which is something that we call UPIT, which is a unified point-in-time solution. And which also means that the snapshotting mechanism that we have today, which is vSAN sparse, is going to be replaced with a new snapshotting mechanism. As such, I would also expect that something like link clones will more or less disappear from a vSAN standpoint in the future. You will be using different types of technologies to leverage vSAN in a smarter way, a better performing way as well.
I mean, I would imagine, you should be able to get some savings from doing this, right? Like that's what we've seen with most customers. Now, exactly how much? There's a ton of factors that go into that, so it's kind of hard to say a priori.
Exact is tough, but I could make it easier. So I've calculated the bottleneck with memory and CPU to fit about 1,100 VMs in each cluster. Okay. And right now, with the full clones, I can fit 700. And so by switching to instant clones, would it be feasible that the memory and the CPU would end up being the bottleneck if we switch to an instant clone architecture?
It'd be more likely.
So what I'm saying is
the bottleneck today is storage. Sorry, what's the bottleneck today?
With the CPU and the memory bottleneck being about tied, we can fit about 400 more VMs onto each vSAN if storage was infinite and not variable. And so the question is by switching from full to instant clones, if you think we'd be able to go from 700 to 1100 quite easily, or even 1200.
So and when you say storage is the capacity limit today, you're talking about storage gigabyte capacity, not storage latency or IOPS capacity.
Physical storage, about 76 terabytes in each vSAN.
So then Mike, this is not a doctor's diagnosis, so I think we'd all say let's dig into the details. I would say that with a very high degree of certainty, you'd be able to go from 700 and add an extra 400 to get, at which point you'd hit the CPU and memory limits on your current host configs.
So with instant clone, you will save certainly on memory because you're sharing memory. On the CPU side, you don't necessarily save CPUs if all the different VDI instances are running simultaneously, but because instant clone fires up VMs and takes them down dynamically based on when they're actually used, it makes it so that, assuming the usage is somewhat random and not everyone's using it always at the same time, you can actually get more of these users on there in a given day or some week time frame, right?
Question, because I just learned something from you, Kit, but you said that the instant clones actually ease the memory bottleneck?
Yeah, so taking a step back, the idea with instant clones, you have a running virtual machine, kind of frozen. Let's say it's a Windows machine, like frozen in some state just after booting, right? But it doesn't yet have an identity, really. So it's kind of like this identityless Windows machine that's just booted. The idea being, instead of creating some persistent VM that's saved to disk and you kind of manage it and update it and patch it over time, you have this kind of pristine VM that when a user needs to log in, we basically do a fork of it, essentially a running copy of it, right? That running copy will, again, copy all the CPU registers, all the state. It will mark all the memory as copy on write. So those two things are separate, right? The original one cannot be affected by the copy. But all the common memory will be shared. So it dramatically reduces the memory footprint because all the common Windows memory is shared, whereas anything that's particular to that one, like the specific user settings or specific applications that user is running, will be in the separate memory area. So if you have a single host, you'll have one central copy of that pristine Windows. You might have 100 or 200 users sharing that memory. Right?
Now again, your mileage will vary depending on how much of the user memory, like the guest memory, is a function of the common base OS memory footprint relative to what the users are doing.
Think about how much memory it takes just to run the base OS. And then freeze.
Well, it's the applications as well, right?
So you could fire up some common applications in that standard one as well. And that way you share the application memory.
So one thing to know about VM fork or instant cloning, as we just mentioned, it uses transparent page sharing on the back end to map those memory pages. By default, that is turned off. So transparent page sharing has been turned off by default. So you need to make sure that you enable that for your VDI environment specifically, and specifically for instant cloning as well. So make sure to think about that when you go through the exercise.
I don't want to overcomplicate the problem, right? Basically, he was saying, I can currently get 700.
The answer is yes, just do it.
Yeah, just do it.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You should get app volumes as well.
What's the worst that could actually happen?
We'll get app volumes. Just checking on that first question, I heard Duncan say that we could increase the size of the disk groups. Is that the only variable that we're able to change in order to increase that ratio?
No. More or less, yeah.
You could muck around.
There are no advanced settings that I know of where you can tweak the
any hint of any
tweak
futures,
the algorithm or whatever it is. No.
Any hint of futures where that might change instead of being disk group level? All right.
Not in the near future.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
By the way, one thing I'll just note, just a little note: distributed global dedupe is a ridiculously hard technical problem, right? So what ends up happening is people generally compare deduplication algorithms, and they're comparing things that are non-distributed systems and things that are distributed systems, right? So vSAN is a distributed system, and so it uses dedupe inside the write cache D stage into the disk group as its dedupe path, right? Trying to maintain a global dedupe hash, which would be necessary, is an insanely difficult problem. Now, I'm not trying to do a product plug, but this is how Extreme IO does its dedupe, but it has to have crazy, weird, specific hardware to do that, right? And obviously one big bonus of vSAN is you don't need crazy, weird, specific hardware. You have very generic, baseline hardware requirements. So I know you weren't trying to do this. It makes me a little grumpy, not that this is about me, this is about you, but it makes me grumpy when people basically throw out dedupe rates and they're comparing these like broad, very different system architectures, and they're comparing dedupe rates as one aspect of data efficiency. So, capacity and data reduction efficiency is a function of so many compounded things. The dedupe rate is one factor. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. And I see some people obsessed in the metrics. I've read that they actually create more backups than they need just so that they can see the dedupe metric go up, which is clearly focusing on the metrics rather than the whole issue.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks.
Yeah, more of a open-ended question around vVols and vSAN. So in the past few years, both have received a lot of attention, and I kind of just wanted to get the panel's impression of where we're headed. I hear a lot about being excited about vSAN and hyper-converged infrastructure, but what about
vVols.
External arrays and vVols?
Yeah, I got it.
Can I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, how many people of you have attended a VMFS session today? Because there was one session on the schedule that was more or less about VMFS, right? So people are asking me, why is there only 1 or 2 sessions on virtual volumes as it stands right now from a VMware perspective? Well, that's because it's just a feature. It's a feature that's part of the platform. Yeah. We spent an enormous amount of time over the last 2 years to educate partners and customers, and now it's up to customers and partners to start implementing it. We'll have 1 or 2 sessions going forward, but that's going to be more or less it from our perspective. Why? Well, it's just part of the stack, just like VMFS, VAI, VASA, and all of the other parts of our storage stack. So from that perspective, it's not from a VMware standpoint that the investment has gone down. It's from a marketing perspective that the focus has changed more towards vSAN because that's a product which is a different sales cycle.
I'll give a slightly different answer as someone who has a storage portfolio inside our wheelhouse here, right? And I can remember, man, what was the first VMworld where we did vVols demos? It would have been like 2011.
Yeah, Satya was still here. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
6 years ago.
And I thought that this was going to be the shiz-it, right? And in fact, in my role at EMC at the time, right, one of my tasks was to make sure that we were always doing everything that we could to basically be the best partner for VMware on our own merits as a separate company and push and drive hard. And I literally grabbed all the roadmaps for VMAXs and Extreme IO and VNXs and Unity, and I'm like, you guys have got to make vVol support P0 priority inside your priority roadmap. Now, where we stand now is vVol support is pretty well universally industry-wide. People have varying degrees of vVol implementation support, right? Let's just say industry there, right? Which I think is Duncan's kind of point, hey, it's there, right? Adoption of vVols has not been great. The customer
hold
you're
on.
talking about...
Let me rephrase that. It depends on the vendor you work for. Right? We have some partners that have great adoption from a vVol perspective. Those are typically the smaller partners that have a newer storage platform and introduced vVols in the early days.
Thank you for the correction. I'll speak for myself.
Okay.
I'll speak for myself.
Great adoption, but in terms of total VMFS deployment, what's the percentage of vVols?
It's not really a fair comparison. I mean, we have 500,000 customers doing vSphere. Yeah. There's probably 150,000 still doing version 4 and version 5, which has no vVols to start off with.
Let me finish the train of thought. Just one.
It's not a comparison.
I'll hold it back.
We have
fine.
So the customer one of the 2 customers that you cover is one of the largest vVol deployments in production that I know, and they have thousands and thousands of VMs and many tens of thousands of vVols underneath the covers on their array that are up and running. So there are absolutely large-scale deployments on our own, and I'm sure there are others that have 100% adoption of vVols inside their user base. What I have found surprised me. The problem was that vVols represented a change in an operational model for the storage team. Okay? So it had nothing to do with tech, right? So basically, vVols hand over a great deal of the provisioning psychology and process from the storage team over here to the VMware team over here, right? And the VMware team was like, awesome, great. You give me, your provider endpoint. You give me your vVol pool, your data store, and I'm off. I can go to town, right? And what happened was customers resisted it because it was a change in their operational process and procedure that they couldn't handle because they had separation of church and state between their virtualization team and their storage team. Which is why, by the way, the people who have large installed bases that have existed for many, many moons have a slower adoption rate. It's because literally we've got a bigger legacy install base. That would be my thesis, at least.
Yeah, I get that.
Now, the thing that's been interesting is that vSAN forces a culture break. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, when you have vSAN, you don't really have a storage team for your primary storage VMs, although many customers have both, so it's not one or the other. And so what we see is vSAN adoption is much more rapid because the technology is naturally associated with an organizational and cultural change.
It's also not entirely true, because it's also the most, at least in my opinion, the most difficult thing to do from a vSAN perspective is explain the vSphere administrator that it's not okay to actually reboot a host, right? Most of the storage administrators, you won't see them rebooting nodes or whatever it is, right? But from a vSphere perspective, it happens all the time. Just click, right-click host, reboot, and
persistence.
The storage is gone. Happens all the time. But very difficult to explain that to vSphere administrators. Operational aspects.
But by the way, we're committed to vVols, and every platform keeps adding more and more support. So, and we're like everybody else in the industry.
Thanks. All right, thanks for the question. We have time for one more. Yeah.
My question might sound like a negative dig, but what I'm really getting at is really wanted to see your perspective on maybe some legacy or not contemporary features that have existed in VMware and several technologies, and how the solutions that are coming out and being announced and being advanced are maybe getting around some of these problems. But Rick, you mentioned, Kit, that you were responsible for vMotion. And as a network architect, my burning, angry, bitter question is, are you the reason that it happens over layer 2? But that's not really my question.
Oh, really?
I would like to know so I can make a special dartboard of your face. But
Damn!
Down.
So I was under the impression that we supported layer 3 vMotion since 2 years ago. I could be mistaken.
But that's years of war in the data center. But really things like that have persisted, and maybe features that haven't been as contemporary as they could have been. What are things that you guys are excited about that are coming out that kind of works around some of those challenges that we've had similar to layer 2?
Okay.
This is a great question, by the way.
Imagining my face on a dartboard. This is a new thing for me. Wow.
You could sell those.
I know. Wow. Next level stuff. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad. If I reach some point in my career where like...
it's a good thing.
Okay, a couple of things. So understanding the question, you're talking about technologies, like long-lived technologies that had certain design elements to them that maybe were necessary at the time, but maybe aren't now, that we can kind of question those assumptions. Yeah, well, on vMotion 1, we had to do it at layer 2 just because we didn't know much. We couldn't make many assumptions about the application running inside. And so, we went all the way down to layer 2. We did reverse ARPs on the network to redirect the MAC traffic to go, to telling the switches to switch ports to the other ESX hosts and those sorts of things, right? Now, again, as we got more, and there's all sorts of this stuff, like, there's a lot of hard questions we had to answer. Fundamentally, vMotion is essentially a race between the network, or the network send rate and the memory dirty rate of the VM, right? If those two rates, if the network send rate is not faster than the memory dirty rate, then you have a convergence problem, that we can't get all the memory over there. And so that creates some really unique challenges in various sorts of pathological cases of vMotion, where we have one option is we just stop the VM with a higher amount of dirty memory, and that means the VM will be paused for longer as we transition over all the rest of the dirty memory and start it up on the destination host. Or we could just move the VM over and have some of its memory still on the source host, which now means the VM is actually relying on 2 different hosts simultaneously for its correctness. And if one host goes down, then the whole thing dies. Or we can actually slow the VM down on the source host, and that way it'll dirty its memory at a slower rate because it's getting less CPU cycles, and thus the network can so like those sorts of things. Because we didn't understand what the application was, it was hard to make those sorts of trade-offs. So I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing, especially with the advent of containers, is that we can now get inside the VM. So one of the biggest things a design principle for VMware has been treat the VM as a black box. It doesn't matter if it's a Windows app, with Exchange, or Linux with some Java app, DRS, vMotion, HA, SRM. All of our products work across all these different things, generally speaking, right? And now with the advent of containers, I think the opportunity is we can actually get inside the VM and see what these workloads are doing and get a lot more context, allowing us to do much greater optimizations and be much smarter about what we can do there. Before we had to be very conservative because we wouldn't know, what we were breaking. But I think what we're seeing now is we can get inside the VM and get a lot more information. We can do a lot more interesting things.
I'm going to do speed round. First, I'll throw myself under the bus. Classic symmetric cylinder track sector logic that is actually deeply embedded to support these ancient legacy hosts that still exist terrifyingly, causes this huge technology debt as we try to move storage array land forward, and I hate it. It drives me crazy, it drives the engineering teams crazy. But again, it's this world of how do you straddle these two universes that's Another thing that drives me crazy is frankly, they're not here to defend themselves, but I think VRA is too complex. I think VRA is too complex.
Better.
It's getting better. And by the way, the hope, so this is a negative and a positive. You asked, I'm seeing the VRA simplification in 7.3 and the VMware Cloud on AWS efforts where there's a SaaS project around VRA, create cultural change inside that team because they have to own the life cycle. Mm-hmm. That's great. One other thing, let's see, that is the VCD. I still run into customers that use VCD for tenancy. Yeah. And I think
we have we are working on some research projects to see how we can put multi-tenancy into vSphere. Yeah. Right. So a lot of those problems, API issues, the vSphere API today is designed to support any old VM from 20 years ago, MS-DOS type crazy thing. How can we simplify that dramatically in a cloud world, right? If you look at modern APIs like GCP has, they're very easy to use, very streamlined. They don't give you, they have a lot of options, but not nearly as many as we have. So how can we simplify that? Given a lot of these more modern workloads don't need all the nerd knobs that you traditionally needed because of the wide diversity of settings that we're
But notice each one of those negatives, there's active work to try to tackle those problems.
All right, I'm going to wrap this up because we're getting out of time here. Duncan, any comments to the question? A couple seconds.
Well, from this question, the question's point of view, I think the biggest thing that annoyed me over the past years was resignaturing VMFS volumes. If you're a site recovery manager user, customer, you know what I mean. If you have 250 LUNs, you need to resignature them. It takes days. Yeah. So in VMFS 6, we actually made a huge change, and we resignatured the volumes actually in parallel, which means that there's a 10x to 20x improvement in terms of time. Yeah. So that was one of the biggest things in the 6.5 release, which not a lot of people seem to know about, but it's an awesome tiny feature.
PDL I still run into PDL and
just get a proper storage solution, then you won't run into those issues. But we'll talk about that.
All right. Jonathan.
No, I just think it's amazing to see how far we've come in such a short period of time. I mean, really, we're sitting there talking about, vMotion, early days evil, right? But I mean, just how far along that's come, how far along the technologies have come in a very short period of time, just since, we've all been doing this, right? I mean,
I can't believe that Kit developed that when he was 8.
Right, exactly.
That's right.
Put his Legos aside.
That's right. Wrote vMotion. All right. Well, thank you all very much for the questions.
Thanks, everybody.
The panel, thank you.